Namaste and welcome to another episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. I'm your host, Roshan Karyappa. December 3rd marked the 49th anniversary of the India-Pakistan War for the liberation of East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh. It was perhaps one of the most significant events, not just from a military perspective, but also from a geopolitical context. And in this episode, we're going to be discussing all of these various aspects with our guests, both of whom are eminent columnists and podcasters. So we have Adit Kapadia, who runs Mind Makers, which covers politics and policy focused on India, joining us. Welcome, Adit. Nice to have you here again.
Hi, Roshan. Pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah. And we also have Mohal Joshi, who hosts the India Rising podcast. Mohal has a deep interest in geopolitics and defense. Welcome, Mohal.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, Roshan.
Yeah. So we have plenty to talk about, and maybe we can begin with you, Adit. What is the political significance of the 1971 war? Everyone recognizes the crushing defeat of Pakistan in the war and also the creation of Bangladesh. But what changed from a geopolitical perspective?
So there are two parts to this answer, right? First, we'll go for the political part, and then we'll go for a geopolitical answer. Political part, obviously, people remember, Indira Gandhi emerging how she did as a very strong leader post the war and everything. What people forget is that basically the war itself in 1971, the elections happened a full year before it in 1970. So Indira at that time was battling the syndicate on the Congress side, and in the 1969 presidential election is where the whole vote on the conscience between VV Giri and Neelam Sanjeeva Reddy happened, and she told everyone to she basically split the Congress. So the columnist Veer Sanghvi had this excellent line in his book where he said that Indira recognized that the country was looking for an alternative. So instead of providing a different alternative, she split the Congress and provided an alternative from within the Congress. So it was a continuum, right? So that's what happened. And after that, she won a huge election victory where everyone had written off the Congress because the syndicate was fighting as Congress O, as people would remember, Congress organization, and she was fighting on Congress I. And this is the current Congress avatar we know. The reason I took this trip down memory lane was because after the election happened, you had the 1971 war and stuff, after which she won 9 assembly elections in a row, which was unbelievable. And from there, you then had the emergency 3 years later and everything like that. But in that portion, I think what changed was India emerged as a force to reckon with because India took on the Western might. I think it also pushed India a lot closer to Russia than it was before. And it sort of pulled India to a left of center political way because a lot of people forget in 1970 elections, apart from Garibi Hatao, Indira Gandhi also had started this Samajwad Zindabad in her thing. So if you want to know which was the pinpoint where the socialist underbelly was invoked massively, it was probably the 70 elections. And then after 1971, it became more and more, and especially because of the role that US played, where, it sided Nixon and Kissinger looked the other way, where it sort of sided with Pakistan and stuff. A lot of people actually grew a little skeptical of America, and I think it pushed India to that. But as and we'll talk about this in the future as in the next few minutes and stuff. As we saw, it was not like India completely cut off all its ties with US. There was a lot of back channel diplomacy going on. So that's how it shaped the whole political / geopolitical difference.
Right. Fantastic. So, Mohal, what is the military significance of this war? It was the first comprehensive win for India, right? I mean, about 70,000 odd prisoners of war were captured and so on. Can you talk us through what the significance was militarily?
Yeah, so I think actually 93,000 soldiers were taken POW.
Okay.
So the military significance is this was the first comprehensive win in the India-Pakistan realm. So if you think like 1948, like there was a kind of a stalemate after which Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru took the resolution to the UN, which basically did a status quo for the next few years. I mean, which is actually still exists up to today. In 1965, I mean, Pakistan did start the war, but eventually, like, we did ended up capturing like a lot of territory of Pakistan, but there was no comprehensive win. I mean, we were, I think, if I'm not wrong, like we were almost on the outskirts of Lahore by the time the war ended. But due to the international pressure, I mean, there was not a satisfying conclusion. I mean, we can call it like a stalemate where like we were at the advantage in the end. So 71 was where there was very good tri-service um, coordination between all the three, like the army, the navy, and the air force, plus the spectacular work done by RN Cow and the RAW, the excellent intelligence services, which provided a significant role, and it broke the Pakistan into two, which also sent a strong political message.
Right. So, Adit, we spoke about the elections as well, right? The Indian elections, and of course, I mean, 1970, the Bangladesh elections as well. One of the things that Indira Gandhi did was she recognized Bangladesh, right? And what do you think about that? What role did it have in sort of expediting the inevitable in some sense?
I think a very significant role, because you had the prime minister of the immediate neighbor where the Bangladeshi refugees were going to, right? I think the numbers were, I don't know, 90 some lakhs. I forget what was the number of refugees that
10
came.
million by the end.
Yeah,
just before
more than a
the-
crore.
1 crore. So yeah, 90 lakhs is the conservative estimate, and then it goes up. And what is interesting is 70% or 80% of them were Hindus, if I'm not mistaken. So this, let's make no mistake, this was a genocide, right? That was happening. It was a one-sided thing, and you had the Pakistani establishment and the whole role played by people like General Tika Khan and all those people. But I think when Indira Gandhi recognized this, you had probably the first step taken in that thing of recognizing a separate country that was just the need of the hour, right? And what Mohal said, this was actually being done in consultation with Mr. R.N. Kao. So actually, if you guys read The Cowboys of Raw by B. Raman, and Nitin Gokhale also writes this book, but in his book on Kao, he doesn't go into detail, because he said that all of the Kao things about 1971, he's going to gain access to them in a few years. So that's going to be in a sequel that he writes on Kao or about 1971. But B. Raman indicates that where Kao actually, and there are various accounts even after that, Kao said he needed some time, before his intelligence showed that the Mukti Bahini also needed to be trained, so forth. But I think this sent a message that India actually was a sort of a player in this whole. This was not a Pakistan versus Bangladesh, Pakistan versus people of Pakistan sort of thing, because the refugees were coming to India. India was not a country that could actually afford to take on another 1 crore people and feed them and so forth. And I mean, let's be practical about it, right? Humanitarian side is one thing, but the practicality of it is, in 1971, India was in a terrible shape economically. And the whole Garibi Hatao thing worked, but people forget that in 2 years, people went angry because none of the promises that Indira Gandhi actually made came to fruition. And this whole bank nationalization and stuff was there, but the socialism was pushed in a very different way. So it meant that you are dumping, or there is more population coming on, which is as a taxpayer, on the Indian taxpayer. So within India also, I think there was sentiment, and this we can only go on anecdotal evidence, because there is very few, there were no polls then, right, where you went and talked to people, aapko kya lagta hai? This you talk to people who were around that time, and what they say, that there was support that this has to be tackled.
Right. I think the chief ministers of a couple of states wrote to her as well, I think formally, West Bengal and Assam, about the migration as such.
I mean, Tripura, if you remember, the amount of refugees that went into Tripura were 3 times apparently its own population. So just imagine the stress. And this was just like few years, if I might add to what Adit said. Like, I mean, only Adit, a few years ago, we were surviving on PL 480 grains from the US, right?
Yeah.
So we were barely like hand to mouth, and like we couldn't like
Yeah,
just possibly sustain like 10 million or 1 crore refugees, you know.
I don't know if this is Mohal's subtle way of bringing up the green revolution and then linking it to the farmers' protest right now. But sorry, and one thing I have to tell you. So at that time, a lot of people forget the in Bengal also there was a very interesting thing where because the it was going through a very tumultuous time. So Ajay Kumar Mukherjee was the chief minister of Bengal till March 1970. Then there was a president's rule for 4 months, or actually one whole year, from March 1970 to April 71. Then after that, Ajay Kumar Mukherjee became the chief minister again for just 87 days. After which there was another spate of president's rule for 265 days. And after that, in 1972, you had Indira's loyalist Siddharth Shankar Ray become the chief minister of West Bengal. And there are numerous accounts of how Siddharth Shankar Ray was brutal in its handling of dissent and communists. And as a result, what happened is he still remains the last Congress guy to ever become the chief minister of West Bengal.
Say, like last.
So that's
and
something.
Also we had the height of the Naxali movement in West Bengal, right? So
Yes.
I think that in the beginning, Indira Gandhi and like the folks, they had some concerns that if we introduce too many refugees, like there could be some of these leftist student protesters who could come from Bangladesh and resettle in India and just make the Naxali problem worse. So like it was kind of like, it wasn't like Mujibur and Indira, like they weren't like too keen on like a separate state. They were like kind of iffy about it. But I think as the summer grew on and the refugees, as Adit said, like up to 90 lakh or a crore possibly, I think they just started realizing slowly. So it wasn't like many people think, oh, from day one Indira thought and Mujibur thought we want a different nation. It was a slow and gradual process which ratcheted up. And at the end they said, you know what, we want a new country, but it was not the end. So it was not an inevitable solution, you know.
Right.
So I'll just say one line, Roshan. I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No,
But
go ahead,
basically,
please.
the whole concept of Bangladesh was an idea in evolution.
Hmm.
It didn't start by saying Bangladesh. It started with simmering dissent in Pakistan after the 1970 election, where Mujib, although he won more seats, he was not allowed to become the prime minister. Then the whole Bangla versus Urdu sentiment, where one language was looked down upon on the western side of Pakistan. And then the impracticality of splitting a country into two with another larger country in between struck people finally, and two countries so geopolitically diverse finally sunk in. Then the refugee crisis happened. Then Indira was forced to take a position. Then the Iron Cow thing happened, and then finally the whole concept of Bangladesh was raised.
I mean, and also a tinge of racism, right? I mean, involved, like the West Pakistanis looked down on the East Pakistan, even though East Pakistan had more contribution to the economy, the exports of the combined nation, the military, the civil services was all controlled by the West Pakistani. So they said like this is like kind of no representation, and like, you know, we are carrying the burden of the Western neighbor.
Right. Okay. I mean, there were plenty of things that precipitated the war itself, right? I mean, as Adit mentioned, you know, the 1970 elections where famously Sheikh Mujibur Rahman won the majority, but was not allowed to take power. And then again, you know, these migrations and so on. No, Mohal, the war itself, right? I mean, it was actually held off, right? I mean, because of the monsoons, if I'm given to understand, because it wasn't prudent to fight during the monsoons or whatever. So from April to actually November or December, there was this whole period of very tense period as such, right? Talk to us about some of those things, you know, what really happened during that time.
So now in a very famous interview, I mean, Sam Manekshaw claims that Indira called her to a cabinet meeting and asked like, Sam, what are you going to do about it? So Sam like shot up and said like, you know, like, what do you want me to do about it? Like, I can't just go into Bangladesh now. I mean, I cannot guarantee you success, but I probably will guarantee you failure. Now, many researchers have tried to see like if there are any official cabinet records at meeting, but it doesn't exist. So I don't know whether it's maybe a collection of series of events or one particular striking event. So he said that basically give me a few months to prepare. like it was April. So he said like in a few months when the monsoon comes, I mean, and Bangladesh is a riverine country, right? So you have thousands and rivers, and if they are in spate during the monsoon, you're going to get bogged down. So he said, give me till November when two things happen: the monsoon is abated, and also remember, right after the monsoon, the passes in the Himalaya open up. So there was always a concern, even in the military planning, which I can talk later on. There's always a concern that the Chinese could intervene in terms of helping out the Pakistanis. So he said, like, okay, in the November, the passes will close. Give me 6 months to prepare, and the ground is formed up. So it's easy for like armor and soldiers to cross the country. So we can fight a war in the winter when the Chinese can't intervene and the ground has been prepared, And also militarily he prepared. See, like India, we had war with in 48 and 65. Remember, in 65 there was almost no action on the eastern front. It was all limited to the western front. So the positions of the Indian army and the formations have been all deployed to the western sector. So he had to reorient everything to the eastern sector to invade Bangladesh. So it wasn't like, okay, you just give a go and I can do that, because it was like all oriented to the other side. So yeah.
Right.
So this is like what they did was basically, so like in the planning phase, it was basically the chief of army staff, then general, later field marshal Sam Manekshaw, the Eastern Army commander J.S. Arora, and his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Jacob. So this was the rough plan, that they wanted to do a 3-prong attack. So basically what they did was, the 2 corps was stationed in Calcutta, opposite the western part of Bangladesh. And I think this is where Lieutenant General Niazi expected the main thrust of the attack to come. So he put a lot of his forces to defend on the western flank. On the northern front, the 33rd Corps, which was based in Sikkim, was pushed to do a push into the northwest part of the Bangladesh. On the eastern front, the 4 Corps, which was basically formed in the 1962 war to combat the Chinese threat, was moved down to Tripura under the, I think, India's one finest tactical commander, Lieutenant General Sagat Singh, to put a thrust into eastern Bangladesh, the eastern part of Bangladesh. And interestingly, there is a weirdly named 101 communication zone. It was kind of a formation which was not exactly a corps in terms of like but they are like a few brigades out there, which was set just to the north. I mean, it was kind of a tactical reserve also, because see, there was always a concern that the Chinese would intervene. And interestingly, I mean, it snowed pretty late that year. So I think until the very end, and we can come to the Tangle airdrop and stuff, like it was held in reserve, because Sam Manekshaw always had a worry, even though some of the other generals, I believe like Jacob mentioned, that this was not going to happen. I was held in the reserve. And even like interestingly, they took a calculated gamble, which is also a credit to the Indian Army. So they basically, to get the 33rd and the 4 Corps, because see, we also had a threat on the western border, so you can just bring everything from the western border. So the 33rd Corps and the 4 Corps, they thinned them out from the border areas and they relocated them closer to the Bangladesh zone to fulfill this criteria. So this was the general order of battle. And I mean, if you want me to go over the actual battle in December, I can go over it later on.
Sure. Yeah, we can cover some of those key events during the battle itself in a little bit. So, all right. I mean, so I think November, I think the Pakistani Air Force sort of like transgresses on our airspace, and December 3rd, formally there is a declaration of war, right? I mean, they attack. They attack India. During this time, there's also a lot of international pressure on Indira Gandhi, right? I mean, famously, that BBC interview that she did,
Right.
there's a lot of pressure in terms of, hey, there are all these migrants coming in, and then this sort of a propaganda of India equipping the nationalists, Bangla nationalists, and so on and so forth, right? So there's all of this international pressure, and she deals with it with a very firm hand, right?
Absolutely. She deals with it with a very firm hand in our admiration of Aaron Cow, which he required. He deserved a lot of praise for everything. One thing we forget is the team around Aaron Cow, that it wasn't just him. You had someone like Sankaran Nair, who was an able deputy, or as B. Raman and Nitin Gokhale would call him, an able foil to Aaron Cow. His relationship with Sam Manekshaw, because it's very important that the military and the intelligence were on the same thing, and the other diplomats. He had two major contacts within the Bangladesh government, links to the Bangladesh government. There was a guy called Banerjee, or Nath Babu, and I would suggest reading Nitin Gokhale's book for that, and Major General Sujan Singh Uban, right? So the reason I say this is because when you talk about building up international pressure, it didn't just come through the center. It also came through a lot of outreach through ambassadors, diplomats, and so forth, which were briefed by Cow and the whole section of military and so forth. And the major factor here was, how do you counter this in the respect of Nixon and Kissinger's outreach to China, their quasi support to Pakistan, and we all remember the whole December 16th, and we'll discuss in detail when the war happens, where the American ships and stuff were getting closer to the Bay of Bengal, but that is later. All this happened in April, May, and so forth. And India's whole thing, where the only ally India had at that time ostensibly was Russia, because the European Union was basically an extension of the American foreign policy, and they would just go wherever Nixon goes. Another thing I want to add to this is, I think what might have benefited India after the war and after 1972 was an inadvertent thing that happened in America with the whole Watergate and that scenario, that Nixon got so embroiled in his domestic policy thing, that I think the whole focus that they had on Pakistan and so forth kind of went, and that only resumed after, little bit after. People forget, I think Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State for only one term, right? So technically he should be viewed at the same level as a John Kerry or Hillary Clinton. But I think American foreign policy in those 4 years was more interventionist than it probably ever was or ever will be in various countries here. And in a lot of other countries, it actually sowed the seeds of what US was going to do. Then you had the whole Iran issue a few years later, 5 years later. South America, you had a lot of issues. So I think that's what India had to put up with, where you had Western power sort of ostensibly be back in Pakistan, and how does India stand up for its self-interest? And that's where the interviews happened on BBC.
Right.
I mean, she did a whirlwind tour in November to drum up support in the Western capitals, and I think she even famously met Nixon. After which, like, Nixon, I mean, I don't want to speak of her, but like she used very bad word like the B word and the W word for her.
Yeah.
So she did unsuccessfully try to lobby. I mean, I think there was more recognition in the European capitals that this was something mass atrocities were happening in Eastern Pakistan or Bangladesh. But as Adit rightly said, just because of the outreach, the secret outreach to China through Pakistan, the internet, so he didn't want to upset like Yahya Khan by making any kind of statements, even though the State Department was fully for censuring Pakistan or putting some pressure. I mean, in one famous memo that Kissinger wrote, Nixon on the margins wrote like, don't squeeze Yahya Khan at this time, because he just wanted to do the outreach. And even on I think Kissinger came to India in like April 71 or like somewhere during the summer. So he first visited New Delhi, then he went to Pakistan, and then feigned an illness and went to China in a Pakistani airplane to set up the outreach. So this was the shenanigans Kissinger and Nixon were doing, that they were just looking completely the other way when a genocide was occurring, just so that they can get the outreach to China, because they wanted to get pushed back against Russia. So it was like a whole big geopolitical game. So it's like when you talk about the Bangladesh war, you have to talk about Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and US. And also one last thing, that the ambassador DP Dar, who was the ambassador in Russia, I think he pushed Indira quite a bit for this treaty of friendship, which proved useful in the end. That in case the Chinese intervene, the US wanted to. Sorry, if in case the Chinese intervene, the Russia would come on side of India. And then I mean Nixon, Kissinger. I mean I know the beauty of having so much tapes on Nixon was that in one he and Kissinger were just offhandly like discussing, oh, you know what, if India in a way has war with Pakistan, China will come. Okay, then if Russia comes on their side, oh, then we will go and like bomb Russia or something. Like it was like offhand, like talking nuclear war as if like it's child's play. So it was like a whole big political, geopolitical game that was whole set up, and we were just pawns in it.
Right.
One line I'm going to say, Roshan, before we move on thing, I think if you want to get the measure of Richard Nixon or absolute unfettered contempt for that guy, just listen to his private conversations and you'll know what I mean. He was a douchebag of the highest order. I mean, I have no doubt in my mind of that.
Right. Right. So Mohal, the war starts and it ends in about 13 days. It's possibly the shortest war, as they say, right? One of the shortest, at least in contemporary history. Break down this war for us. I mean, so it was a very action-packed war. I mean, on many different fronts and many different events and so on and so forth. So break down this war. What are the key events that happened?
I'll go to the land part first, if you don't mind. So if you can bring up the map.
Yeah.
So see, like Bangladesh is a riverine country. So now what, from the defender perspective, like Lieutenant General Niazi, he had a choice. So he said, okay, either we can build garrisons in the outlying areas, or I can fall back to, if you see there, like Dhaka, which is the heart of Bangladesh, is surrounded by three rivers, the Padma, the Meghna, and the Jamuna. So he could have done a much better defense if he just built a huge fortress around these three rivers. But like the Pakistani army in its wisdom said, like, you know what, no, I mean, just like Hitler did in Second World War, like not an inch of land was to be surrendered. So they did an outward defense instead of a collapsing on the center, which would have provided a better defense. So what the Indian army did, and like Manekshaw, Jacob, and Aurora said, like, we'll do a blitzkrieg, because you remember the international pressure was so much that they had to end the war quickly. So they said, we'll bypass all the strategic hard points and just rush to Dhaka. So initially, interestingly, the original plan that Manekshaw wanted was to say, okay, we will capture like Khulna and Chittagong, which are the two main ports, and we'll capture like roughly some of the territory, force the migrants to go back and not go for Dhaka. But Lieutenant General Jacob, to his credit, insisted upon the Dhaka being the main target, so which he did, and eventually they did relent later in the summer that Dhaka has to be done. So a brilliant campaign run where like they just bypass many of the, so what ended up happening was that many of the Pakistani garrisons, they got trapped, and one of the best operations was Op Meghna by the 4 Corps, left by like India's finest tactical commander, Lieutenant General Sagat Singh. So the Meghna, I mean, which is like pretty wide river, so there was a challenge that how do you get across the Meghna, because Pakistan was well fortified around the Meghna. So he did Op Meghna, where they, with using 14 Mi-4 helicopters, they just transported everybody across the Meghna river. So what ended up happening was that the Pakistanis got trapped because India leapfrogged them across the Meghna river, and the Pakistanis got trapped. So now they had a lot of strength, and that, I think that thing happened in a lot of the other sectors where Indians just bypass all the strong points because they were in a rush to get to Dhaka before international pressure was so much that even the Soviet Union could not save us. So a lot of these strong points were leapfrogged, where they could not mount a sufficient defense. That was the tactical genius of the Indian army. Now coming to the Navy part of it, I think one of the 65 war, the Navy was kind of left out of the action. So here, what we did in the early days of the war, I think in Operation Trident, like 3 missile boats of the Osa class, they went and bombed Karachi harbor, which caused a lot of damage to the shipping of the Pakistani Navy. And I think they repeated this in another operation a few days later. So this was a significant scale that they damaged and destroyed like the oil facilities in Karachi harbor and sank a few ships. And also the now the famous in the eastern seaboard, I mean, the most well-known event to people is the sinking of the PNS Ghazi. So the PNS Ghazi was deputized to sink India's only aircraft carrier, the Vikrant, and it was laying mines of Vishakhapatnam. Now, there are some disputes as to whether Indian mine ship sank her, or basically she just went over her own depth charges. The mines that she laid and sank, the ship sank. But anyways, it was she was harassed by many of the Indian ships who detected her, and basically the sinking of the PNS Ghazi basically meant that the end of operations in the Eastern Front for uh, the Pakistani Navy. And also, I think I'll refer to one brilliant book by Sandeep Unninathan, like Operation X. So what India did was that they trained, like, I think around 500 odd naval commandos, like, who were given limpet mines and who went to the various ports in Bangladesh, like Chittagong. And I think they sunk anywhere from like 40 to 100,000 tons of shipping. So they practically disabled the Pakistani naval assets in the country, while the land forces had um pure dominance. And in the air also, India had established dominance, as I said, on the 3rd of December. I mean, it was like kind of strange that uh, everybody was waiting that India will make the first move. But I mean, it's like it sort of conveniently suited India that Pakistan started the war, so India had no hesitation to start the war, because they could use the excuse now, okay, we were attacked, so we start the war. I mean, the war was anyways going to start in a few days, but Pakistan just made it convenient for India. So once we had air dominance, it was like a end game for Pakistan, where they couldn't possibly survive. And I think around the middle of second week of December, they started making calls for ceasefire to US and other capitals around the world.
Yeah.
Right.
And
yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Roshan. Yeah.
No, I was going to come to you on, what was the trigger exactly for the US to start moving in?
So I think the ultimate thing was that let me ask you one thing. Do you mean moving in during the war, or do you moving before, like moving into the geopolitical thing?
During the war, I mean.
I think it was very simple, that because of India's victories on the eastern side, and at that time, I think when the whole decision was made, Pakistan had not opened a western front, if I'm not mistaken. I think the whole thing was that they tried to pressure the United Nations into doing like a ceasefire, and then the US would come sort of there, and the whole thinking was that India would withdraw, and then things, status quo will be maintained. And there is a very famous sort of video on YouTube that I would urge everyone to see. Basically, it's Sardar Swaran Singh, who was India's, I think, representative to United Nations. He led the Indian delegation to the UN General Assembly to explain that position, and where he's actually questioning George H.W. Bush at that time, who was the US ambassador to UN, and then became the president 20 years later. But at that time, the sowing of the seeds of what happened in that discussion, or in that vote, when UN tried to do like a ceasefire or sort of vote, Russia actually voted against it. And because of a permanent member, Russia, showing the veto, India was able to carry forward. But in August 1971, there was a treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation signed between USSR and Republic of India, where Swaran Singh and Andrei Gromyko signed this for 20 years. It was enacted in 1991. So those were sort of the whole situations, that because Russia supported the UN ceasefire, the UN ceasefire could not go through. I think US December 14th or 18th is where the intelligence was that the US carriers are coming in. So the war, I think,
Fleet.
Yeah, Seventh Fleet was. So there was pressure on, or there was an ultimatum that finish what you have to before, and the 13-day war was won. And then Pakistan opens a front in Longowal, or on the western, the famous Battle of Longowal, which most kids of the 90s thought went exactly as how the movie Border went. And I have to tell you guys, it did not. I think India only lost 2 people. We were 120 and they were 2,000. That is right. But India was still 118 by the end of it. And the Indian Air Force didn't just show up in the last 5 minutes. I mean, the Indian Kuldeep Singh Chandpuri did a fantastic tactical job. But then the Indian sort of Air Force came and so forth. So.
Right. And so, India equipped the Mukti Bahini as well, right? I mean, to fight like the Bangla nationalists as such. I mean,
absolutely.
So, Mohal, you want to talk about the role of the Mukti Bahini in this war?
Yeah, I think they provided a lot of key intelligence and even support during the campaign. I mean, see, for any war, I mean, interestingly, this is also the period 1970 when the Vietnam War was going badly for US. So they didn't have local support on the ground. So I think having local support on the ground is very important if you want to win a war, because in most places, like the Indian soldiers were greeted by Bangladeshis as like with cries of joy Bangla, and treated as liberators is what I mean to say. So that provided a lot of, I think even in that famous Tangel airdrop, so if you can go back to the map, so what happened like in the end was that once it started snowing in the Himalayan passes, so I think all the Indian generals were like confident that they wouldn't there wouldn't be any intervention by the Chinese. So finally the 101 communication zone was given the go ahead to squeeze the Pakistani forces in Bangladesh. So what they did was the Mukti Bahini set up shop in like Tangel. So the whole goal was that if they can drop way behind, because like for the 101 communication zone, which hadn't started the war much, they had to get to Dhaka before like other, because by the middle of part of the war, what happened is that I think Niazi and the Pakistani generals, they said, okay, you know what, let's withdraw whatever brigades we can, or like army formations we can withdraw, because the whole goal was that we will, either two things could happen to save us, either the Chinese or the Americans will come to intervene, or we can fall back our soldiers to because they knew that the whole aim was to capture Dhaka. So one of the goal was to withdraw the 93rd Brigade from the north of the country for the defense of Dhaka. So India said, like, okay, we will bypass it. So let's drop in. So with the help of Mukti Bahini, we dropped a battalion of 700 soldiers well behind enemy lines, and the Mukti Bahini played a key role in setting up the ground. Now, interestingly, I mean, there's a funny anecdotal story that after the drop happened, like the second para jumped into action. So like in the Indian side of things, they said, okay, we wanted to run a story on the Tangel airdrop. So they contacted the PRO of the defense force, armed forces. So interestingly, he didn't have any pictures. So I mean, this was like the pre-internet era. Like otherwise, they would be on social. If there was a airdrop like this today, they would be on social media by now. So he said, okay. So he went to Agra, where that parachute regiment was there. The brigade was there, and he said, like, okay, you know what? Can I have pictures of this? So they just took old pictures from the exercise they did the past year, and the PRO published pictures like of the old one, and he just mentioned the headline of brigade. So they said, okay, when a platoon had when a battalion had dropped, he said brigade. I think that greatly demoralized the Pakistanis, because they thought that a whole brigade had dropped, and in fact only a platoon had dropped. So this cut off the retreat of the 93rd Brigade of the Pakistani army. And also interestingly, because this was so shocking to the Pakistanis, that initially when the Indian dropped, they never expected Indians to be in this area for the first case. So they thought, oh, the Chinese have airdropped troops, so they are going to save us now and we are going to win the war. So initially the Pakistani soldiers were completely befuddled, and they thought, okay, these are the Chinese. But later on, when they were fired upon, they realized, oh, this is shit, this is the Indian soldiers, and we are in big deep trouble. So I think the 4 Corps advanced from the east. They were and both were on the outskirts of Dhaka by the end of the 14th December.
Right. And what decisively ended the war, so to speak, was the attack on the governor's office in Dhaka, right?
Right.
Yeah. So on 14th December, I mean, it's almost like the 2nd Para Brigade and the 4 Corps from Lieutenant General Sagat Singh were on the outskirts of Dhaka, they were within artillery range. So what the Indian from the Mukti Bahini, again credit to the Mukti Bahini, forwarded some information which India also verified through its independent sources. So it was double confirmed. So
one thing One
Yeah.
thing I just wanted to add one line, Mohal, because because before you go into the final part is about the
Sure.
role of Major Sujan Singh Uban, who played the role of training the Mukti Bahini fighters.
Right.
First, I think they were called the Mujib Bahini, and it
Mhm.
started with about 850 people on June the 1st, and I think then it went up to 6,000 people, and where they went to and reached to the tea plantations, the jute mills, around the Chittagong area, and so forth. So this was like this old school Chanakyan strategy of you attack the center, but first you win the edges first, right? And the coastal towns and so forth. And it obviously helped that those areas were bordering with India. So the role played by him and the joint secretaries of RAW in East Pakistan, like I said, Banerjee and other people, it was quite fascinating. And I think there was the originally it was I think it was called Operation Jackpot, if I'm not mistaken, the one that was run by Uban. I don't know if it was eventually called that, but that was the plan of calling
Yeah, I
it.
mean, it was like a subset of Operation X. So yeah, Operation
Operation,
Jack.
exactly. But yeah, sorry, I just wanted to talk about
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
and then you can
Right.
go on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So actually, you Guru, from the Chanakyan study that brought up a good point I forgot to mention. So the overall defense of Bangladesh, what Pakistan thought was that the main thrust of the attack was going to come from the second corps from the west. However, what ended up happening was India. I mean, Sam Manekshaw, for his brilliance, he put and the hardest part, see, like if you look at how the crow flies, the easiest way to get to Dhaka is from Tripura, but that's the least developed region. I mean, even like today, the Northeast is not that developed. Imagine in the early 1970s. So Indian Army, they moved like I think 50 or 100,000 tons of supplies to Agartala. They built a lot of blacktop roads. So while Pakistan thought that the main thrust of the attack was coming from the west, it ended up coming from the east through Lieutenant General Sagat Singh. So again, coming back to the Governor House attack. So what ended up happening, they had double confirmation through various sources that they were going to they want to have a big meeting on the Governor House. So Indian Air Force, like they equipped like four MiG-21s with like rockets and guns, and then they launched an attack on the Governor House. I think this pretty much demoralized the Pakistanis. I think there were like the governor fled to the UN sanctioned building and resigned on the spot. And I think even like some reports say that like General Niazi was almost in tears because he realized that the end was near. And I think that's when on 14 November, I think Yahya Khan had pretty much allowed Niazi to do whatever was best for the remaining soldiers, and he did send a message through the US consulate that we are ready to do a ceasefire. I mean, not exactly a surrender, but for this mysterious Nixon Kissinger ways, the message wasn't delivered to India for almost like 1.5 day.
Right. So Adit, I was curious about the China role. I mean,
Yeah.
we hear about the US and the USSR, right, in terms
Hmm.
of the Seventh Naval Fleet moving in and that that
Hmm.
resolution being vetoed. Uh, we have touched upon the China role, but what was the China angle in the entire equation?
I think the China angle was a very curious one because ostensibly you would expect them to support the Pakistanis,
Hmm.
right? But they, on crucial points, they almost stayed away of it. It was almost, to use a very old proverb, not my pig, not my farm. Which is, I mean, essentially it wasn't their fight, so they were staying away. And mind you, what was fascinating was we had only fought a war with China 9 years ago.
Hmm.
So, I mean, 1962, and we had skirmishes at the Nathula in 1967, where India obviously came on the top and stuff, which was 4 years ago under the prime ministership of Indira Gandhi. But I don't know if it was this time because of the Soviets taking an active role and so forth, because we don't hear anything from China on the 1971 war. And I think it is also curious to note that the closeness between Pakistan and China happened a lot after 1971. At that time, Pakistan, I would say, was closer to US than it was to China. Yes, China was there and China shared cordial relations with Pakistan, but I don't think Pakistan was as dependent on China as they are today. Like today, they they are not even willing to say a word about the Uyghurs in China and what they are facing. And they do a better job of defending China than their own envoys, a lot of people would say. but but that is the China angle. But one thing I wanted to point out, because when we talk about politics and geopolitics, this is just a sort of a indicator of how quickly things change. If 1971 and 1972 or 70 and 71 were the years where Indira Gandhi couldn't do anything wrong, 1974 and 75 were the years where she couldn't do anything right, because where she had the very fantastic role she played in the 71 war. You had the disaster called the Shimla Pact in 1974. You had then the Navnirman agitation, where she completely miscalculated. And the Navnirman thing happened in Gujarat, and then Jayaprakash Narayan wrote this, and then she imposed the emergency. So it was almost like in how 3 years the fortunes kind of changed as well of all this. So this was a very significant military win for India. But where the blood, and a diplomatic win too, if I may add, but where one blunder can undo a lot of diplomatic wins was what happened in 1974. So it's that is the sort of the dichotomy that India plays with right now.
And also on the China angle, I wanted to add that as part of this treasure trove of Nixon tapes we have, so he said like to Kissinger that like, can we get China to intervene? And I think even in this UN meetings that Adit mentioned, there are some reports that they met with the Chinese envoys to start a front. I mean, he said like they don't need to start a war. They said like, oh, can't they move few formations towards the Indian border just to be menacing towards India? And China said basically no, thank you at that point.
Right. So Mohal, at the end of the war, I think it was about 90,000, as you pointed out, prisoners of war that we had captured from Pakistan. And I think if I remember correctly, they were brought to Agra and then to Ranchi, and then they were let go, right? I mean, they were handed back to Pakistan. And some people feel that, we should have held that as a bargaining chip and probably have scored a strategic, point there, right? So what do you feel about that?
I mean, that's like one of the perennial questions. Like this. First of all, see, like we couldn't have held them forever because we also had a lot of refugees to take care of. And I mean, under the Geneva Convention, you are supposed to repatriate troops back to their country. We cannot hold them forever. So it's always now what happened in the Shimla meeting when Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, after Yahya Khan resigned, came and like he said that, oh, I cannot. Basically, I think Ajit, if I'm not wrong, they wanted to make the LOC as a de facto international border, correct? So they said that, oh, I will not survive if I go back and agree. So basically, he sneaked his way out, and India didn't get any major concessions, which has been a source of heartburn for. So the troops, I don't think we could have kept them forever as a bargaining chip, but the other concessions could have been extracted where, I mean, some people claim that the Pakistan is hoodwing the Indians, and others claim like, no, that was the best we could do. So it's, I mean, also we had a lot of international pressure at that time, mind you, that we couldn't keep the captured territory forever,
Right. No, I think it was also miscalculation. I don't buy this all hoodwink theories and stuff like that. I don't think Indira was that naive, nor were we like backstabbed or something. I just think it was a strategic miscalculation, and that's what happened. And in my joke, at the peril of offending 1,000 people, I'm going to say is India or Indian journalists have always miscalculated when it comes to Bhuttos, whether it's Zulfikar or her daughter Benazir. And if you listen to Karan Thapar, he still talks about Benazir Bhutto in very glowing terms about that 1974 visit. So, and you would almost think that Karan Thapar has stopped analyzing Benazir Bhutto objectively after the 1974 visit.
I think Bhutto, for like, I mean, he wasn't like great for India, but like he was a pretty shrewd character who, see, he was like I think a minister under Ayub Khan, right? I mean, a defense minister. He rose through the ranks, became a defense minister. He egged Ayub Khan to do the 1965 war. Then when 1965 war goes pear-shaped, I mean, in 69, I think Ayub Khan is deposed. Bhutto is still there. before the 1970 election, he starts his own party. And under Yahya Khan, he doesn't want to concede that. I mean, even Yahya Khan didn't want to concede the election to Mujibur Rahman. Then when Mujibur Rahman, when Yahya Khan is deposed, he becomes the new arch savior of Pakistan. So, I mean, he's a very character who survived through a lot of trials and tribulations of Pakistan, which was like pretty turbulent in those times.
Right. Right. So this,
And
of
also
course,
after the
starts a...
war.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go on, please.
No, I mean, and then...
Are you trying to say Pakistan is not turbulent today? I'm sorry, I couldn't resist.
No, I mean, I had a point about Bhutto and the legacy of the war, but I guess we can cover it later on.
No, actually, I was going to ask you that. Ask the both of you, actually. So this, of course, starts a whole new chapter in Pakistan, right? I mean, so Yahya Khan quits, resigns after the war, and then Zulfikar Ali Bhutto takes over. And then that starts another chapter. What is the legacy of that? I mean, so what happens after that?
So I think the legacy is the nuclearization of Southeast Asia, because as now we all know the famous quote that we will eat grass, but we will make the atomic bomb. So they saw that, okay, they were split into half. They couldn't take another risk where maybe in the future, India might try to sever like Balochistan or Sindh, or like maybe take back POJK from them. So they said for our safety and security, and I mean, they have done a decent job of threatening India from behind the nuclear umbrella, because then they started the terrorism in the 80s and the 90s. So they just put them down the path of getting an atom bomb. And after the 1974 test under Indira Gandhi in Pokhran, they said they pretty much accelerated it, saying like, okay, there is no chance, we have to get the atomic bomb, otherwise we'll get threatened to India and we'll get split in two again. So
right.
Yeah, and then you had the strange thing about the Bhutto family, right? Where in just 3 years after Shimla, Bhutto was arrested by Zia-ul Haq and then was executed in 1979. And his kids too, except for Sanam Bhutto, Benazir Bhutto, we all know what happened to her in 2007, right? She was assassinated. Then you had his two kids, Shahnawaz and Murtaza. Shahnawaz was found dead under very mysterious circumstances in France, and Murtaza Bhutto was killed in a police encounter. So even then, the Bhutto family, personally, I think also after that, I don't think right now has the same sort of significance it did. Yes, this Bilawal fellow is leading them and all that, but I don't think so. It was a very curious sort of period between India and Pakistan, and that period of 1977 to 1980 saw a very intriguing thing where Zia-ul Haq sort of took over in Pakistan, and you had Indira Gandhi voted out of power after the emergency, and a new government coming in for 3 years. And then just when people thought in India it would be unstable, then India made sure that even the new government made sure that there were free and fair elections, and there would be no semblance of an emergency. But Pakistan went into the completely other tangent where Zia-ul Haq imposed a very Islamist rule. The military took over for 10 years till 1987, and it pushed Pakistan into a state of permanent instability from which I don't think it has ever recovered.
Right.
I think one of the other legacies is also the 1971, the 7th Fleet sailing into the Bay of Bengal. So one more point I wanted to add was that, as per some reports, like the Russians also sent submarines and ships to counter the Russian threat the American threat. So I think that left a lasting impression. I mean, even 49 years after the event, practically, the 7th, see how 180 degrees the relations of India and US are gone. But I think for some people of the earlier generation, I think it still rankles them that America sent an aircraft carrier. So it's still I think that just nosedived that was probably the nadir of Indian-US relations, which didn't recover, because after that we had the war in Afghanistan where they needed Pakistan as a client state. So it just pushed India, probably till, I would say the 98 Pokhran, right after the Pokhran. So maybe for the next 20-30 years, India-US relations nosedived pretty badly.
But I don't understand. The same people who did this and advocate stronger relations with Russia and China forget that we fought a war with China in 1962, and that our prime minister passed away in Russia in 1965, and no one really knows what the hell happened, right? So, I mean, here is the point. I think international relations are complicated, but the point was Indira Gandhi after 1971 enabled, and a lot. One thing we talked about politics, right? That's where the life comes a full circle. After the Congress, she split the Congress in 1969. Her new friends, the Communist Party of India, supported her, right? And in then lied this very strange understanding that Mrs. Gandhi came with the complete left side, and then you had the Nurul Hassans and all those people coming in, which is where a lot of the rewriting of Indian textbooks, which pandered to a very left sort of narrative, also happened after the 1971, after this strategic alliance with the communists, not just on the political front, but also on the social front. So a lot of this anti-Americanism also comes from that, where they are ready to forgive China for taking away its Indian territory in 1962, but they are not ready to forgive America for sending an aircraft carrier. In my opinion, I would bash both of them equally, but look at our practical reality and who our natural allies are.
Right.
And the fact that I am sitting in America and can say this about Nixon, I would like anyone from China to sit in China and say the same thing about Mao.
Yeah, I agree.
That's the basic thing, right? I mean, you have two people in America resoundingly bashing the American president sitting in America,
Right.
or Richard Nixon, and no one. I forget that. I would like anyone in Communist Party of India headquarters to talk about Mao. Even they can't do that.
Right. No, I don't think Nixon has a lot of love lost in the US anyway. So,
but Roshan, people forget his record when he came back to power in 1972. I think the popular vote was unmatched. I don't think anyone could equate the amount of votes he got by percentage for a long time.
The Reagan second election.
No, Reagan didn't either.
Okay.
Wow. Okay.
I think Biden got more in percentage, but I'm not sure.
Okay. So in 1971, we have this new country, Bangladesh, formed, right? And since then, much has happened. Does it weigh somewhat heavy on Bangladesh's conscience that, the role of India in the liberation of Bangladesh as such? I mean, Adit, how do you see the relationship between both the countries?
So I'll come to that in a second. Sorry, I was looking up the statistics. Richard Nixon got 60.7% of the popular vote in 1972.
Wow.
That is unbelievable. Yeah, 60.7%. So yeah, he just swept everything basically. So I don't think any president is ever going to come close to that margin. So that is how popular he was and how unpopular he became. But so India and Bangladesh, I think India and Bangladesh have behaved like two very mature democracies after the whole thing happened, because we've had Bangladesh, let's not forget, only a few years ago we did a land swap agreement with Bangladesh, which was fascinating to think about, that two countries exchange land with not a drop of blood shared, no war, nothing like that. Economically, I think Bangladesh is our natural ally on a lot of things. A strong Bangladesh on textiles. Actually, a lot of people would say Bangladesh has even done a little better than India in some parameters. And I think ultimately you had the Sheikh Hasina government throughout, which is a left of center government, but usually has not been that bad on the economy and has advocated for strong relations with India. The other side, you had a Khaleda Zia government. So that's when the India-Bangladesh relations took a dip. Yeah, because Khaleda Zia had that connection to the connections to the old establishment when the East Pakistan was there. And there were some ministers who were a part. But I think Sheikh Hasina has been very brutal. And I think it also stems from the fact that her entire family was assassinated. Merely months after
Mujibur Rahman was assassinated 2 years after the formation of it.
2 years, I'm sorry. Exactly. Troubled history. And so I think that's what. And Sheikh Hasina then was in India. Actually, she flew to India right after this happened. And so I think that happened. I would like to say that even today, I think yesterday, I'm just looking up the news basically that about this, that India and Bangladesh actually signed a deal in an economic arrangement, and they relaunched the cross-border rail route after 55 years. So I think Narendra Modi and Sheikh Hasina just announced it, that the Haldibari Chilahati route will be commenced on December 17th, and the date is not lost on the populations of India or Bangladesh. They could have chosen any other date, but the fact that they chose December 17th, a year after December 16th, or tells you how significant that day is in the psyche of India and Bangladesh, and the relationships almost have evolved around that fulcrum.
Fantastic. I think isn't there I think this year there was going to be a centenary test or something, test match between like India and Bangladesh on the.
I mean, probably, but unfortunately, with this thing happening,
yeah, it's not going to happen. But I think like next year there might be a big celebration, because we're reaching like 50 years of the India liberation of Bangladesh.
But one thing I have to. Yeah, one thing I have to put in a caution, Roshan. I think we also have to acknowledge that there was a rising Islamist trend in Bangladesh. There were attacks on Bangladeshi Hindus. Let's not forget. Sheikh Hasina has cracked down on it, and Sheikh Hasina has actually done quite well in countering that. But that simmering Islamist sentiment is not just on a political level. It's actually gone into the social sort of understanding and stuff. And till that happens, India will have to tread with caution. I think we have to have strong relations with Bangladesh. We cannot be interventionist when it comes to Bangladesh, yet we cannot stay quiet if there is one-sided attack being perpetrated on Bangladeshi Hindus. So there is a sort of a balance that we have to do. But if you ask me net, I would say it's a very positive relationship that India shares with Bangladesh.
Yeah. Right. I mean, we still have the Teesta water sharing agreement to be done. So hopefully, maybe, I don't know if there's a change.
I just wish that the Bangladesh cricket fans calm down a little when we play them. I mean, they just go ballistic. My goodness. I'm like, it's just a damn game, guys. Calm down.
Just one Rohit Sharma no ball can do so much damage, I guess. But I mean, so coming to the I think the Teesta water sharing agreement has been like kind of stalled, because I think Mamata Banerjee doesn't want to agree to it. So maybe if there is a change in ruling dispensation in West Bengal in like probably 5 months, then there could be some movement on it later on. Maybe.
Are you visiting Kolkata in the next 5 months? If you make such statements, make sure you're in a bulletproof car, which is like shatterproof and all that.
No, I'm not going anywhere with COVID till I get a vaccine.
I'm just kidding. Roshan, go ahead.
I mean, the land sharing agreement, to their credit, I think was signed by Prime Minister Modi and Sheikh Hasina. So I think the next logical agreement is the Teesta water sharing agreement. If they can get, I think that can close a lot of the legacy issues outstanding between India and Bangladesh. And I think, as Adit mentioned, I think Bangladesh has probably crossed like Pakistan's per capita GDP, or probably even doubled it. I mean, it's even like gone ahead of India. So they are like a booming economy. And I think, as Adit mentioned, I think when Sheikh Hasina is there, I think the relations always remain very cordial and good with India. But when with Khalida Zia, like we had a lot of infiltration of terrorists through the Bangladesh route, which has been pretty much camped down on by Sheikh Hasina. So yeah, I mean, we are in a good place with Bangladesh for sure,
Right. So Mohal, what are the key military lessons from this war? Anything that we've learned from the 1971 experience that could come to bear today?
I think one of them, as I mentioned earlier, was the tri-services coordination, which was excellent. And I think they did set up some joint commands. So that would be a very important lesson to learn. I mean, during the 65 and 62, I mean, the 62 war, we all know that the Air Force was not even used, in spite of China having negligible amount of air resources in the 62 war. So I think we came a long way, 9 years from like being badly defeated in the 62 war to the 71 war. So a lot of the lessons were learned of jointness. I think with the chief of with the CDS, like Bipin Rawat being appointed as a first CDS, I think we are on to onto that phase. I don't know if we get to a theater command like how the US does eventually. So that was another lesson, was that say many of these wars post World War II, they don't drag on for months. Maybe there might be a Vietnam or a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It will be probably the next wars will be, I mean, the amount of social media pressure now we have, probably a 10-day or a 14-day war. So whatever objectives you have. So the other part was also having a clear and concise objective. I know one of the criticisms post of Parakram, probably the parliament attack, was that okay, like Vajpayee didn't go to war. Now the Vajpayee in his like some I think I forget whose interview was it, maybe it was Shekhar Gupta, somebody, he said like he asked Vajpayee, why didn't you go to war? So Vajpayee said all the generals told me we can go to war, but Vajpayee asked back that what is the end goal, how do we get that? So I think setting a clear concise goal that we need Dhaka to fall and Pakistan, Bangladesh liberated. So I think having clear concise goals, jointness, and the other part was the brilliant military strategy where like the Pakistanis thought we are going to come from the west, but the biggest move was from the east, from the four core, and also like the blitzkrieg tactic where we just bypass all the hard points. This is like something from the World War II, because in 65, as I said, we got bogged down. So bypassing all the military hard points, just going for the heart, the end target of Dhaka, and making sure it fell. That was, I think, a brilliant strategy on the Indian part.
Right. So Adit, considering that the present circumstance where on both fronts, I mean the situation is tense, right? Both on the China and the India Pakistan fronts. How do you read the current political situation in context of what happened in 1971? How do you compare that? Do you think Prime Minister Modi can has the same sort of advantages that Prime Minister Gandhi had in 71 after that convincing win?
Yeah, I think so. I think probably even more so, because I think diplomatically and internationally, India is probably on a stronger footing than it was in 1971. I don't think China would do anything with Pakistan, because the American support too that exists now. I don't think America will favor Pakistan the way it did. Now the battle is also different. I don't even think we can have like an all-out war like we did in 1971. It would be sort of strategic things here and there. But where I think India has to be careful is diplomatically through these human rights organizations and through this international pressure and stuff. They try to isolate India now and then on many things and so forth. But I think India is well up to the task. And another thing, economically, India is a far greater consumer than it was in 1971. And as much as India wants to be an net exporter or something, all the West cares about is how much we import from them, right? So as long as that exists, or that trade relationship exists, I don't think that would happen. But having said that, if Pakistan does something like this, or if we do see something like that from China, will India respond? Absolutely. We saw what happened after Pulwama, and we had how the Balakot strikes happened and so forth, and that was on a smaller scale. But I think it will be incumbent on the government to respond in kind. But I just don't see this happening now.
Right. Okay, so before we sign off, let's do a game of counterfactuals. I mean, these are always like interesting, right? And you guys can suggest you guys can suggest stuff as well. Another prime minister that you guys would pick who would have handled the 71 war better, or as well.
Whoa.
So I wouldn't go into handling war or something better, but given what Vajpayee did in Kargil with 182 people in the Lok Sabha, it would be very interesting to see how a Prime Minister Vajpayee's strategy would have evolved if he had like a full majority like Indira Gandhi did. I think he would probably be just as strong, but his response would be very, very interesting to see, like his personal response, so to speak.
Right.
So that would be my sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah, I think I would say Vajpayee or PV Narasimha Rao would be interesting to see how they would deal with such a situation.
Right. Okay. Another general or field marshal that you would pick in place of Sam Manekshaw, Mohal?
I would pick I think Lieutenant General Jacob, and Sagat Singh. I think Sagat Singh, as I said, like, see, Sagat Singh, I know Aditya mentioned about the 67 clashes. So the Lieutenant General of the 17th Mountain Division was, I mean, maybe there was Major General at the time, was Sagat Singh. And he was also involved in the liberation of Goa. So he had like a very glorious campaign: liberation of Goa, Nathula clashes, and the center of gravity with the four-gore attack from the east, Tripura into Dhaka. So I think Sagat Singh would be, and Lieutenant Jacob, who insisted that we don't go for Khulna and Chittagong and capture those ports. And he fought against Sam Manekshaw, saying that we cannot not take Dhaka, which some believe, like Sam and others believe, it was very hard to achieve. So to his credit, he fought for it, and eventually the Sam relented that, okay, we'll go for Dhaka and not Khulna and Chittagong. So I would say Lieutenant Jacob and Lieutenant General Sagat Singh.
Right. So who do you think is the most underrated person in this event? You know, I mean, both of you can take a stab at this.
That's a very tough question. But I would say the most underrated are the Indian diplomats and Indian strategic operatives that actually trained the Mukti Bahini at a great personal risk. I think another sort of underrated were the Indian intelligence officers and the Indian diplomats. Imagine Indian intelligence officers had to train the Mukti Bahini in a Pakistan that was controlled by the generals in 1971, and how insanely hard it was. And when we remember the lieutenants and the commanders who actually led or were leading the armed forces, let's not forget the small officers who made this actually happen.
Right. Mohal, any books or films that you would recommend on this war?
Yeah, so one book, like I think the RN Cow book by Nitin Gokhale, I think it goes into deep detail on the aspect during the 1970s. I think it has a couple of chapters covering the beginning and during the 1971 war.
Okay. Adit, any recommendations from you?
Yes, a couple of things. One is the book by B. Raman, Cowboys of Raw. Absolutely fantastic account. Nitin Gokhale's book, as Mohal said. There is also a movie, at the risk of offending a lot of people, I was going to say, but watch the Ghazi attack.
Ghazi, right?
Yeah, the Ghazi attack. And I did not say Razi, I said Ghazi.
Ghazi.
And one more thing I wanted to add it on the underrated part. I think we have to, I would say, like, it would be Lieutenant Jacob, because for one more reason, because when the surrender was going to be done, so he was sent at a great risk to Dhaka to talk with General Niazi, and basically Niazi wasn't like very moved. So he said, okay, I'll give you 30 minutes, and if you don't surrender, basically he threatened them, that because they were surrounded by Mukti Bahini on all sides. So they said that we will ensure that you get safety, because they're going to be lynched probably by the Mukti Bahini if they were. So said, we cannot be responsible for, if the war continues, then you can get lynched, all your families can, and we know what you have done to the Bangladeshis. So he stood his nerve, and he made sure that Niazi signed. Even when he came back after 30 minutes, Niazi wasn't moved. He said, okay, I think you are going to sign it. And he pretty much convinced to end the war right there on the spot. I mean, Niazi was a broken man by then, but he also had not only in the planning part, but also like getting the surrender signed by Niazi was also no mean feat,
There is a short film actually on this.
I was just
YouTube.
Thinking of that. I think Milind Soman plays the
yes,
role
Milind
of
Soman plays Jafar Jacob, and Yashpal Sharma plays General Niazi.
Right.
The cricketer Yashpal Sharma?
Nahi bhai.
No.
Actor Yashpal Sharma. Okay, I hate doing this. Give a pop culture reference. He's that Lakha from Lagan who betrays and then becomes.
Okay.
So that was my pop culture reference of the day.
That was an interesting film, actually. Yeah. All right. So we've come to the end of the podcast. I mean, it was fascinating. You guys lent a lot of color and perspective to all of these events that we hear about and read about. So thank you so much, Adit. Thank you, Mohal. And we hope to catch up with you on a different podcast and talk about something else. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us, Roshan. This was great.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in. This podcast was brought to you by the team at Bharat Varta. If you liked this podcast, then don't forget to share, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite platforms. We're available on Anchor, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Breaker, YouTube, and a host of other platforms. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you do wish to offer us any feedback on the content or anything else, do reach out to us on social media or get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.